Yeah, my name is Jenny Van Hook, and I'm a demographer. And demographers engage in the scientific study of populations. And so the kinds of things that we are interested in is, zooming up to a large scale in the sense that we look at whole countries and how the populations of countries change over time. And when we talk about time, we're talking about a time scale of decades or even centuries. And so what I'm going to talk about today is understanding what's been going on all around us for the last 30 or 40 years, the rise of racial and ethnic diversity in the American population. And I'm going to start by just telling a personal story. So I grew up in Holland, Michigan, just down the road from here, and in the 1970s. And Holland, Michigan is one of these places in the United States where there's just a single ethnic group, at least there was in the past, and it was populated by people of Dutch origin. And they even had like this annual tulip festival every year, and those people in the Dutch costumes, that was actually a high school varsity sport that you could sign up for to Dutch dance during the parade every year. And then, the streets really were lined with tulips every year. And to this day, they still have this annual tulip festival. Well, but now if you go back to Holland, things have changed a lot. And it's because starting in the 70s and 80s, maybe even a little earlier, a small number of Hispanics started migrating to that place because of the availability of jobs in the fruit picking industry and as well as manufacturing. And now if you go back to Holland, you'll see that 1/4 of the population is Hispanic and 40% of the children in the public schools are Hispanic. So it's been quite a big change. But then when you think about it, this is not remarkable. Almost all American cities are more diverse now than they were 10, 20 years ago. 9 in 10 rural areas are more diverse now than they were in 1990. This is not unusual. It's happening everywhere. And for the most part, this was due to migration, new kinds of immigration. What you're seeing here on the screen is a graph showing the number of immigrants being admitted each year to the country. And this graph goes back to 1840, which is the earliest that we have records for. And it takes us all the way to about 2010. And so the blue represents the number of immigrants coming from European countries. Up until about 1965 or so, immigration to the United States, aside from forced migration from Africa before 1840, was almost entirely made up of people who came from Europe. But this changed right around 1965 when a major new legislation was passed that opened up the doors of immigration to other parts of the world. And then all of a sudden, we saw an uptick in immigration from Latin America, and Mexico, and Asia. And so now Europeans make up a small portion of the immigrants, and immigrants from Latin America and Asia dominate. And so this has filtered down into causing our population to change with respect to race and ethnicity. So, as you might have noticed in the last decade or so, I think anybody would notice this, that certain people become very uncomfortable with these kinds of changes, and so there's been a lot of fear of new arrivals, whether it's based on facts or not. There's been fear that immigrants bring with them certain sets of problems. And so there's been proposals on the table, for example, to limit the number and types of immigrants who are admitted to the country. So if we just follow through with that idea just a little bit, I wanted to think about a thought experiment. What if immigration were actually stopped? Would this actually turn back the clock on diversity? And demographers have tools for answering questions like this. The answer when we actually do the numbers is no. The diversity that we see today is pretty much locked in. So here's a chart. If you look at these bars here on the left, that is just describing our current levels of diversity in the population. So you can see, if you just keep an eye on that blue bar, that's the one I want you to pay attention to. 18% currently of all Americans are Hispanic. Now, if we just fast forward and just imagine, it's not just imagining, but we actually project what the population is likely to look like in 2060. So if we just, in our projections and our models, assume that immigration continues in the future as it has been happening today, this is what our population would look like in 2060. So here we would definitely see an increase in the proportion of Hispanics and an increase in some of these other groups as too, especially Asians. But yeah, so Hispanics would go up to about a quarter of the population. So, okay, so you think, well, of course, that's due to immigration, right? Well, no, not actually. This is the alternative projection when we turn off immigration, all immigration in the future. And you can see, especially when you look at Hispanics, Hispanics look almost the same as if immigration were to continue. And so it really makes, especially when we think about Hispanics, it doesn't make any difference whether immigration were to continue in the future or not. We're still looking at a future where about a quarter of the population will be Hispanic. So why is this? And somebody asked me the other day, is this just because Hispanics have so many children? Well, when we look at that, this is the average number of children among Hispanics in blue versus the average number of children among non-Hispanic whites in red. And there are some differences, but the differences are so small they do not explain what's going on here. They do not explain it at all. So what explains it? So if I go back and I think about what we just said, I will review. It's not immigration. It's not fertility, so what is it? Well, the only thing left is something called cohort succession. And I bet you're thinking, oh yes, of course that's it, right? What is, well, geez, what is cohort succession? This is a demographic term, which really just means that older people are eventually replaced by younger people. And when you look at the current population, subdivided by age, you can see in this graph, this is something called a population pyramid. The bottom part of the pyramid is made up of younger people. The top of the pyramid are the older people. So at the top of the pyramid, the gray is represented by non-Hispanic whites, and then all the other colors are the other groups. So if you look at the top of the pyramid, it's not very diverse at all. So they're mostly whites. But at the bottom of the pyramid, the children are much more diverse. So what happens to young people? They age. What happens to old people? They die. They get replaced by the younger people. So I'm going to walk you through this. Keep an eye on the arrow. So this is 2020, and we're talking about 40% minority at this point. Fast forward to 2025, 2030, 2035, 2040. We're almost to 50% minority at this point. 2045, 2050, we've hit, we've crossed the threshold now of a minority-majority population. 2055, 2060. And you can just see very easily how the aging of the more diverse young population is what is driving the future of racial and ethnic diversity in this country. It's not fertility and it's not immigration. So I guess what I would say, taking a step back, is what is the question we should be asking? There's been a lot of angst and questioning about whether our immigration policy is set at the level that it should be set at because people are so uncomfortable with diversity. But I think the real question is, how can we live as the most successful multicultural society as we can be? Are we going to be pursuing policies and divisive kinds of rhetoric that ends up dividing us? Or is it, are we going to be embracing our multicultural society so that people start to talk together? And I think that's the thing that we've got to think about. Thanks.